The president tonight apparently uncorking another astonishing statement, complaining to lawmakers in the Oval Office about protections for immigrants. Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here? According to a Democratic aide familiar with the conversation, Mr. Trump was referring to African nations and Haiti, before suggesting the U.S. should have more people from places like Norway.
The Spain that Christopher Columbus and his crews left behind just before dawn on August 3rd, 1492, as they sailed forth from Palos and out to the Atlantic, was for most of its people a land of violence, squalor, treachery, and intolerance. In this respect, Spain was no different from the rest of Europe.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Epidemic outbreaks of plague and smallpox, along with routine attacks of measles, influenza, diphtheria, typhus, typhoid fever, swept European cities and towns clean of 10 to 20% of their populations at a single stroke.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
As late as the mid-17th century, more than 80,000 Londoners, 1 out of every 6 residents in the city, died from plague in a matter of months.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
And again, as with its companion diseases, the pestilence they called the Black Death returned. Like most of the other urban centers in Europe, says one historian who has specialized in the subject, every 25 or 30 years, sometimes more frequently, the city was convulsed by a great epidemic.
Tweeting, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
Indeed, for centuries, an individual's life chances in Europe's pest house cities were so poor that the natural populations of the towns were in perpetual decline that was offset only by in-migration from the countryside. That was vital if the cities were to be preserved from extinction.
Tweeting, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
Famine, too, was common. What J.H. Eliot has said of 16th century Spain has held true throughout the continent for generations beyond memory. The rich ate, and ate to excess, watched by 1,000 hungry eyes as they consumed their gargantuan meals. The rest of the population starved. This was in normal times. The slightest fluctuation in food prices could cause the sudden deaths of additional tens of thousands who lived on the margins of perpetual hunger.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
So precarious was the existence of these multitudes in France that as late as the 17th century each average increase in the price of wheat or millet directly killed a proportion of the French population equal to nearly twice the percentage of Americans who died in the Civil War.
Tweeting, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
That was the 17th century, when times were getting better. In the 15th and 16th centuries, prices fluctuated constantly, leading people to complain, as a Spanish agriculturalist did in 1513, that today a pound of mutton costs as much as a whole sheep used to, a loaf as much as a fanega, a bushel and a half, of wheat, a pound of wax or oil as much as an arroba, 25 Spanish pounds. The result of this, as one French historian has observed, was that epidemic that raged in Paris in 1482 fits the classic pattern. Famine in the countryside, flight of the poor to the city in search of help, then outbreak of disease in the city following upon the malnutrition.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
And in Spain, the threat of famine in the countryside was especially omnipresent. Areas such as Castile and Andalusia were wrecked with harvest failures that brought on the mass death repeatedly during the 15th century.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Both causes of death, disease, and famine were so common throughout Europe, many surviving records did not bother or were unable to make distinctions between them. Consequently, even today historians find it difficult or impossible to distinguish between those of the citizenry who died of disease and those who merely starved to death.
Tweeting, go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
Roadside ditches, filled with stagnant water, served as public latrines in the cities of the 15th century, and they would continue to do so for centuries to follow. So too would other noxious habits and public health hazards of the time persist on into the future. From the practice of leaving the decomposing offal of butchered animals to fester in the streets, to London's special problem, as historian Lawrence Stone puts it, of poor's holes. These were large, deep open pits in which were laid the bodies of the poor, side by side, row upon row. Only when the pit was filled with bodies was it finally covered over with earth. As one contemporary, quoted by Stone, delicately observed, "How noisome is the stench that arises from these holes so stowed with dead bodies, especially in sultry seasons and after rain." Along with the stench and repulsive appearance of the openly displayed dead, human and animal alike, a modern visitor to a European city in this era would be repelled by the appearance and the vile aromas given off by the living as well.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Most people never bathed, not once in an entire lifetime. Almost everyone had his or her brush with smallpox and other deforming diseases that left survivors partially blinded, pockmarked, or crippled, while it was the norm for men and women to have bad breath from the rotting teeth and constant stomach disorders which can be documented from many sources, while suppurating ulcers, eczema, scabs, running sores, and other nauseating skin diseases were extremely common and often lasted for years.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting, "Go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came."
Street crime in most cities lurked around every corner. One especially popular technique for robbing someone was to drop a heavy rock or chunk of masonry on his head from an upper-story window and then to rifle the body for jewelry and money. This was a time, observes Norbert Elias, when it was one of the festive pleasures of Midsummer Day to burn alive 1 or 2 dozen cats, and when, as Johann Huizinga once put it, the continuous disruption of town and country by every kind of dangerous rabble and the permanent threat of harsh and unreliable law enforcement nourished a feeling of universal uncertainty. With neither culturally developed systems of social obligation and restraint in place, nor effective police forces in their stead, the cities of Europe during the 15th and 16th centuries were little more than chaotic population agglomerates with entire sections serving as the residential turf of thieves and brigands, and where the wealthy were forced to hire torch-bearing bodyguards to accompany them out at night.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting, "Go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came."
In times of famine, cities and towns became the setting for food riots, and the largest riot of all, of course, though the word hardly does it justice, was the Peasants' War, which broke out in 1524 following a series of local revolts that had been occurring repeatedly since the previous century. The Peasants' War killed over 100,000 people. As for rural life in calmer moments, Jean de la Bruyere's 17th century description of human existence in the French countryside gives an apt summary of what historians for the past several decades have been uncovering in their research on rustic communities in Europe at large during the entire late medieval to early modern epoch. Sullen animals, male and female, are scattered over the country, dark, livid, scorched by the sun, attached to the earth they dig up and turn over with invincible persistence. They have a kind of articulate speech, and when they rise to their feet, they show a human face, and indeed they are men. At night, they retire to dens where they live on black bread, water, and roots. To be sure, La Bruyere was a satirist, and although in the matter of all caricaturists, his portrait contains key elements of truth, it is also cruel in what it omits. And what it omits is the fact that these wretchedly poor country folk, for all of their life-threatening deprivations, were not sullen animals. They were, in fact, people quite capable of experiencing the same feelings of tenderness and love and fear and sadness, however constricted by the limitations of their existence, as did and do all human beings in every corner of the globe. But what Lawrence Stone has said about the typical English village also was likely true throughout Europe at this time. That is, that because of the dismal social conditions and prevailing social values, it, quote, was a place filled with malice and hatred, its only unifying bond being the occasional episode of mass hysteria, which temporarily bound together the majority in order to harry and persecute the local witch. Indeed, as in England, there were towns on the continent where as many as a third of the population were accused of witchcraft, and where 10 out of every 100 people were executed for it in a single year. In one small remote locale within reputedly peaceful Switzerland, more than 3,300 people were killed in the late 16th and 17th century for allegedly satanic activities. The tiny village of Wiesensteg saw 63 women burned to death in 1 year alone, while in Obermarchtel, 54 people, out of a total population of barely 700, died at the stake during a 3-year period. Thus, while it is true that the Europeans of those days possessed the same range of emotions that we do, as Stone puts it, it is noticeable that hate seems to have been more prominent an emotion than love.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting, "Go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came."
At the time La Bruyere was writing, which was a good bit later than the time of Columbus, during which time conditions had improved, the French knew every nuance of poverty. At the top were those who at best live at subsistence level, at worst fell far below, while at the bottom those described as dans un état d'indigence absolu, meaning that no one had food or adequate clothing or proper shelter, that one had parted with the few battered cooking pots and blankets which often constituted the main assets of a working-class family. Across the whole of France, between a third and a half of the population fell under one of these categories of destitution. In regions such as Brittany, Western Normandy, Poitou, and the Massif, the proportion ascended upwards of 2/3. In rural areas in general, between half and 90% of the population did not have land sufficient for their support, forcing them to migrate out, fall into permanent debt, or die. And France was hardly unique. In Genoa, writes historian Ferdinand Braudel, the homeless poor sold themselves as gallery slaves every winter. They were fortunate to have that option. In more northern climes, during the winter months, the indigent simply froze to death.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting, "Go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came."
The summer, on the other hand, was when the plague made its cyclical visitations. That is why in summer months, the wealthy left the cities to the poor. As Burdell points out elsewhere, Rome, along with other towns, was a graveyard of fever during times of warmer weather. Throughout Europe, about half the children being born during this time died before reaching the age of 10. Among the poorer classes, and in Spain particularly, which had an infant mortality rate almost 40% higher even than England's, things were much worse. In addition to exposure, disease, and malnutrition, one of the causes for such a high infant mortality rate, close to 3 out of 10 babies in Spain did not live to see their first birthdays, was abandonment. Thousands upon thousands of children who could not be cared for were simply left to die on dung heaps or in roadside ditches. Others were sold into slavery.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here? Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
East European children, particularly Romanians, seem to have been favorites of the 14th and 15th century slave trade, although many thousands of adults were enslaved as well. Child slaves, however, were as expensive as adults, for reasons best left to the imagination, as indicated by a 14th century letter from a man involved in the business. "We are informed about the little slave girl you say you personally need," he wrote to his prospective client, "and about her features and age, and for what you want her. Whenever ships come from Romania, they should carry some slave girls. But keep in mind that little slave girls are as expensive as the grown ones, and there will be none that does not cost 50 to 60 florins if we want one of any value. Those purchasing female slaves of childbearing age sometimes were particularly lucky and received a free bonus of a baby on the way. As historian John Boswell has reported, 10 to 20% of female slaves sold in Seville in the 15th century were pregnant or breastfeeding, and their infants were usually included with them at no extra cost.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
The wealthy had their problems too. They hungered after gold and silver. The Crusades, begun 4 centuries earlier, had increased the appetite of affluent Europeans for exotic foreign luxuries, for silks and spices, fine cotton, drugs, perfumes, and jewelry. Material pleasures that required pay in bullion. Thus, gold had come for Europeans, in the words of one Venetian commentator at the time, the sinews of all government, its mind, soul, its essence, and its very life. The supply of the precious metal, by way of the Middle East and Africa, had always been uncertain. Now, however, the wars in Eastern Europe had nearly emptied the continent's coffers. A new supply, a more irregular supply, and preferably a cheaper supply, was needed. Violence, of course, was everywhere, as alluded to above, but occasionally it took on an especially perverse character.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
Which was an everyday affair in most locales. In Milan in 1476, a man was torn to pieces by an enraged mob and his dismembered limbs were then eaten by his tormentors. In Paris and Lyon, Huguenots were killed and butchered, and their various body parts were sold openly in the streets. Other eruptions of bizarre torture, murder, and ritual cannibalism were not uncommon.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.
Such behavior, nonetheless, was not officially condemned, at least not usually. Indeed, wild and untrue accusations of such activities formed the basis for many of the witch hunts and religious persecutions, particularly of Jews, during this time. Precisely those years when Columbus was trekking around Europe in search of support for his maritime adventures, the Inquisition was raging in Spain. Here and elsewhere in Europe, those out of favor with the powerful, particularly those who were believed to be unchristian, were tortured and killed in one of the most ingenious of fashions, on the gallows, at the stake, on the rack, while others were crushed, beheaded, flayed alive, or drawn and quartered.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
On the very day that Columbus finally set forth on his journey that would shake the world, the port of the city he sailed from was filled with ships that were deporting Jews from Spain. By the time the expulsion was complete, between 120,000 and 150,000 Jews had been driven from their homes, their valuables, often meager, having first been confiscated. And then they were cast out to sea. As one contemporary described the scene, it was pitiful to see their sufferings. Many were consumed by hunger, especially nursing mothers and their babies. Half-dead mothers held dying children in their arms. I can hardly say how cruelly and greedily they were treated by those who transported them. Many were drowned by the avarice of the sailors, and those who were unable to pay their passage sold their children. This was the world an ex-trader of African slaves named Christopher Columbus and his shipmates left behind as they sailed from the city of Palos in August of 1492. It was a world racked by disease that killed in massive numbers, but importantly, that also tended to immunize survivors. A world in which all but the wealthy often could not feed themselves, and in which the wealthy themselves hungered after gold. It was a world, as well, of cruel violence and certainty of holy truth. Little wonder, then, that the first report back from that Atlantic voyage, purportedly to the Orient, caused such sensations across the length and breadth of Europe.
Why do we want these people from, quote, all these shithole countries here?
Tweeting go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came.